She ruled England for 44 years. She outlived every enemy, every suitor, every whisper against her name. But in the winter of 1603, inside a cold chamber at Richmond Palace, the last Tudor queen did something she had never done before. She stopped speaking. She stopped eating. She refused to lie down. And no one, not her physicians, not her ministers, not even her closest ladies, could explain why. What really killed Elizabeth I? Was it old age? A broken heart? Or something hidden beneath the famous white mask she wore for half a century? Before we step into the shadows of that room, take a moment to subscribe to Little Historical. And if you're ready for the truth no one speaks about, stay with me. Watch the full video link in description. She ruled for 44 years, the last of the Tudor monarchs, a woman who had faced down the Spanish Armada, outlived every rival, and built a legend on a foundation of iron will. But in the winter of 1603, that iron began to rust. After months of depression and failing health, Elizabeth I began her final, most mysterious decline. She lost all will to live, refusing to eat and eventually losing the ability to speak. She rejected the help of her own physicians and, in a strange act of defiance, refused to rest in any bed. She chose to stand for hours, sometimes sitting on cushions spread on the floor, but never surrendering to sleep. Imagine the chilling scene inside a dimly lit Richmond Palace. A queen who had once dazzled Europe now sat in silence on the floor, her finger pressed to her mouth, staring into the embers of a dying fire. What was she afraid of? What secret was she keeping from the world? According to some historians, she had fallen into a state they called settled and unremovable melancholy, a depression so deep it held her in its grip, refusing to let go. Her courtiers were frantic, weary of her paranoia, but still, the queen remained motionless and silent. When her chief minister, Robert Cecil, begged her to go to bed, the once eloquent queen gave a cold, sharp reply. "The word must," she said, "is not to be used to princes. Ye know I must die, and that makes ye so presumptuous." She was acutely, painfully aware that sleep was a rehearsal for death. To lie down felt like an invitation to the grave, and she was not ready to accept that invitation. Finally, her body gave out before her spirit did. Too weak to protest, too exhausted to refuse, she was finally moved to her bed. She slipped into a deep sleep on the night of March 23rd and died early the next morning. They say she passed mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree. But the question that lingers, the question we will answer next, is this: what stole her strength? Was it an infection, the crushing weight of grief, or perhaps a hidden poison she applied to her own face every single day? To understand what stole her strength, we must leave the cold chamber at Richmond Palace and step instead into the shadows of a different room, a darker room, one that existed only inside Elizabeth's mind. For there, hidden beneath the weight of her crown and her years of solitude, lived a ghost. A ghost with the face of a man she had once adored. Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. He had been her final great attachment, a man young enough to be her son, reckless enough to defy her, and dazzling enough to win her forgiveness again and again. She gave him power, titles, and a familiarity that made other courtiers whisper behind their hands. But power, once given, is not easily returned. Essex grew restless, then dangerous. In 1601, he marched into London with a small band of followers, hoping to seize the Queen and force her to change her councillors. The rebellion was doomed from the start. It collapsed within hours. And Elizabeth, the woman who had called him her sweet Robin, was left with only one choice. She signed his death warrant. When the axe fell in the Tower of London, something inside her fell with it. Not just her trust in men, but something far more fragile. Her will to remain untouched by grief. For 2 years afterward, she kept a small portrait of him hidden in a drawer beside her bed. At night, servants sometimes heard her whispering a single name. His name. But here is where the story deepens into something more intimate, more painful, and rarely spoken aloud. Some who were close to the Queen believed that her feelings for Essex were not merely those of a ruler for a favourite, nor even of an aging woman for a younger man. There was a tenderness in the way she looked at him, a vulnerability she showed to no other. When he knelt before her, she would lift his chin with her fingers and call him her child. And yet, there were rumours, persistent and unprovable, that his visits to her private chambers sometimes lasted far into the night, that she would dismiss her ladies and sit with him alone by the fire. What passed between them in those quiet hours, no one recorded. But after his death, she refused to speak of him at all. She would not have his name uttered in her presence. That silence, that fierce and wounded silence, speaks louder than any confession. Grief of that magnitude does not merely sadden a person. It reshapes them. It makes the body heavy, the mind fogged, and the heart unwilling to go on. Elizabeth had lost her father, her brother, her sister, and countless suitors. But Essex was different. Essex was the wound that would not close. And as we will see, that wound may have weakened her just enough to let something else, something insidious and invisible, finally take hold. That wound may have weakened her just enough to let something else, something insidious and invisible, finally take hold. And it came, strangely enough, from the one thing that had made Elizabeth I so unforgettable: her face. For decades, the Queen had presented herself to the world behind a smooth, brilliant white mask. It was called Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic paste made from vinegar and white lead. She applied it thickly every morning, covering her skin from throat to forehead. In the dim candlelight of her court, it made her look ageless, almost otherworldly, like a porcelain doll that never cracked. But porcelain does not breathe. And lead, as we now know, is a slow and patient poison. What the Queen did not know, what no one knew in Tudor England, was that her beauty ritual was quietly killing her. Each day, her skin absorbed a fresh layer of toxic metal. It seeped into her bloodstream, settled in her bones, and slowly began to dismantle her from within. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning read like a confession of Elizabeth's final months. Fatigue that no sleep could cure. Depression so deep it swallowed her laughter. Hair loss, tooth decay, muscle weakness, and a telltale tremor in her hands. Her famous red hair had thinned to almost nothing, hidden beneath heavy wigs. Her teeth had blackened and fallen out. And beneath that white mask, her skin was marked by sores and ulcers that she could not hide from her ladies-in-waiting. But here is the detail that history often leaves in shadow. Lead poisoning does not only attack the body, it attacks the mind. It causes confusion, paranoia, and a strange, unshakable irritability. In her final years, Elizabeth became suspicious of everyone. She accused loyal servants of stealing. She lashed out at ministers who had served her for decades. She would sometimes forget the names of people she had known all her life. And yet, she could not stop applying the mask. Vanity had become armor, and armor had become a shackle. She needed the paint to feel like a queen. But the paint was draining the life out of her, hour by hour, day by day. Some modern historians believe that lead poisoning may have been the true, hidden cause of her mysterious decline. Not war, not treason, not even a broken heart. Just a daily ritual of poison applied by her own hand. And as we will see, the final days of Elizabeth I hold one last secret. One that involves a crown, a silence, and a throne that would never again hear her voice. And as we will see, the final days of Elizabeth I hold one last secret. One that involves a crown, a silence, and a throne that would never again hear her voice. That secret begins not with a scream, but with a whisper. Or rather, with the absence of any whisper at all. By the second week of March 1603, the Queen had stopped speaking entirely. Her ladies would enter the dim chamber and find her standing by the window, her thin fingers pressed to her lips, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the frost-covered gardens. She would not answer when they called her name. She would not eat the bread they brought. She would only shake her head, slowly, as if the effort of refusal was all the strength she had left. What was she thinking in those long, silent hours? Perhaps she was replaying her life. The young princess imprisoned by her sister Mary. The triumphant queen at Tilbury, riding in armor to rally her troops. The glittering courts filled with poets and suitors, all of them kneeling before her. But now, there were no suitors. No poets. Only the cold air and the weight of a crown she could no longer hold. Her ministers grew desperate. Robert Cecil, her most trusted advisor, knelt beside her and begged her to name a successor. England could not be left without a ruler. The kingdom would fracture. Civil war might return. Elizabeth looked at him, and for a long moment, Her lips parted as if she would finally speak. But she said nothing. She turned her face back to the window. Some say she did not want to name James VI of Scotland because doing so would be an admission that she was, at last, mortal. Others whisper a darker possibility. She could not bear to speak the name of the man whose mother, Mary Queen of Scots, she had executed decades before. To name James was to remember that blood. And Elizabeth had spent her entire life refusing to look back at the bodies she had left behind. On the night of March 23rd, too weak to stand, she was finally lifted into her bed. She lay there, her breath shallow, her eyes half closed. Her ladies watched in silence. Just before dawn, she took one last breath, so soft that no one at first noticed it was the last. The Queen was gone. No final words. No dramatic farewell. Only silence. That silence became her final command. She had held England together by sheer force of will. And now, without her voice, the kingdom would have to learn to stand on its own. And now, without her voice, the kingdom would have to learn to stand on its own. But the silence Elizabeth left behind was not empty. It was filled with questions. Questions that have echoed through 4 centuries, whispered in libraries and debated in medical journals. What truly killed the last Tudor queen? The official record says she died of old age, worn down by 6 to 9 years of ruthless ambition and relentless grief. But old age alone does not explain the strange refusal to sleep, the paranoid silences, the way her body seemed to shrink and wither from within. Consider the evidence laid out by modern physicians. Chronic lead poisoning, they argue, fits every shadow on the canvas. The fatigue, the depression, the hair loss, the tremors, the cognitive decline. Elizabeth had all of them. But lead poisoning is slow, patient. It weakens the body's defenses, opens the door for something faster. Pneumonia is another suspect. The damp halls of Richmond Palace, the long hours standing in cold air, the persistent cough her physicians noted but could not cure. Without antibiotics, pneumonia would have been a gentle but certain executioner. Then there is the theory of blood poisoning, sepsis rising from an abscessed tooth or an infected sore hidden beneath her gown. Tudor dentistry was brutal. An untreated infection could have seeded her bloodstream, turning her own blood against her, day by silent day. But here is the most unsettling possibility, the one historians rarely speak aloud. Elizabeth may have died of a broken will. Not a broken heart, though that played its part, but a conscious decision to let go. After Essex's execution, after decades of isolation, after watching everyone she loved turn to dust, she may have simply decided that enough was enough. Her refusal to eat, to sleep, to speak, was not illness. It was a slow, deliberate farewell, a queen dismissing herself from a throne that had become a cage. Her body, ever obedient, simply followed her command. When her coffin was carried to Westminster Abbey, the crowds lined the streets in stunned silence. They buried her beside her sister Mary, the queen who had once burned Protestants at the stake. 2 sisters, enemies in life, now lying together in the cold stone. On their tomb, an inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." But the hope of resurrection does not answer the question. It only deepens the mystery. What really killed Elizabeth I? The truth may still be sleeping beneath that stone, waiting for someone to wake it. The truth may still be sleeping beneath that stone, waiting for someone to wake it. But if we are to understand Elizabeth I's final mystery, we must also understand what she took with her. Not just her crown or her silence, but the answer to a question she refused to speak aloud. Why did she never name her successor? For 44 years, she had been asked, begged, even threatened to choose an heir. Parliament sent delegations. Her ministers wrote letters. The people whispered in the streets. And every time, she turned them away with a smile or a sharp rebuke. She would say that she needed no successor because she would never die. A queen's vanity, they called it. But vanity does not explain the urgency of her final weeks. As she lay dying, unable to eat, unable to speak, Robert Cecil knelt beside her bed. He asked her again, softly, desperately, who should rule England after her breath was gone. Elizabeth raised her hand, just slightly, and according to some accounts, made a gesture toward her own head. A crown. Or perhaps she was simply too weak to lift her arm. Cecil understood the gesture to mean that James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary Queen of Scots, was her choice. But here is the detail that haunts historians. Elizabeth had spent decades condemning Mary, executing her for treason, refusing to acknowledge her son. Could she truly have wanted James on her throne? Or was her gesture a final, bitter joke, a queen mocking the men who had spent their lives trying to control her? Some believe she never named anyone. That the silence around her death was deliberate, a last act of power. By refusing to speak, she ensured that her ministers would have to decide for themselves, and that no one could ever claim she had been pushed into a choice she did not want. She died as she had lived, alone in her authority, surrounded by people who could only guess at her true intentions. That ambiguity became her final gift to England, or perhaps her final curse. The peaceful transition to James I was smoother than anyone had feared, but it left behind a wound of uncertainty. Elizabeth's silence did not answer the question. It only buried it deeper, alongside her bones. And there, in the darkness of Westminster Abbey, the truth about what killed her, and what she truly wanted, still refuses to rise.